way that it's formatted. However, typically I actually encourage people to just print it out. And then the other sheet you'll see, which is just a Microsoft doc that has 3 different categories. And you actually, which I'll go more in depth with explaining, categorize these values based on how important they are to you personally, based on these 3 categories. So what you would do is kind of look off the sheet and then write them down. And the reason I encourage clients to write it down versus cutting it is I just think it gives you more time to like really reflect and think about it rather than just quickly kind of cutting it out and then putting it into the category. I just think there's more thought that gets put into it. So I kind of wanted to explain a little bit of kind of history behind why and when I started doing this exercise and how I've used it and how I think it can be useful specifically at Head First Health. So the cool thing about this exercise specifically is it is a values clarification exercise. So what it's doing is basically asking you to clarify your core values and really get down to really what is simply at your core. And I started doing this in a psychoeducation format. So that was done at my previous job where, it was done with a group of maybe 20, 25 people. However, I've done it in contexts of really small groups of only 2 or 3 people, as well as I've done it with individuals. And I'm actually doing it with a client of mine that's in my next session. So it's very relevant in the work that I do in general. And whether you do the full-on exercise with someone, I think just the questions behind the exercise and really the meaning behind it can be applied in so many different ways. And for those of you that know, with my background and being in substance abuse, I find it to be really helpful to have a values-based perspective. And it's been an exercise that I think has really been helpful in kind of clarifying for clients that are very lost or confused or just feel like stuck in their lives, which is often clients that are in their early recovery, to kind of clarify where they're at. Oftentimes I've done this just to kind of explain what really addiction does to our values. So for instance, I often will ask clients like, how has addiction impacted your personal value system? You can often guess what they say is oftentimes they violate their personal values. So the list that they come up with that is their core values, they've often violated, which in some ways is, I think, instilling hope and often does, because it's kind of clarifying that many times people that are in their early recovery struggle with the idea of, well, without drinking or without using, who am I? And oftentimes this kind of debunks that thought process of, so I just list, what's most important to me in my life, yet I violate these things or I don't live in the service of them at all. So if anything, I'm actually nothing like myself and I'm not myself when I'm using or when I'm drinking. So that oftentimes is a really helpful way of kind of clarifying that and instilling hope in the sense that many times in people that struggle just in general with feeling lost, most often aren't taking care of their most basic needs. So I often refer to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And addiction, ultimately, what it does is it disrupts those hierarchy of needs. And ultimately, the substance becomes the hierarchy and becomes the most important thing, and oftentimes takes away from even taking care of your most basic needs. So I let people know, if you're not taking care of your most basic needs, how do you, expect to get to that full potential of the self-actualization, self-fulfillment needs, which are our values, right? So that in itself is kind of the background of how I started using this, but like I said, I still, with my clients today, find myself using it, even with people that are just feeling really stuck. I think it can often be used with someone that's feeling depressed or just kind of needs a better idea of like the deeper why, like, oh, I have this desire, but I'm just not motivated. And I often tell people motivation is fleeting, but purpose is not. So when you resonate more with your purpose, which is your values, and you live a value-driven life, you're more likely to feel closer to that why. So that's a little background on how I got into using this exercise. And it's from Portland Psychotherapy, which they actually have 7 different values exercise that I've pulled that I will send to you guys to reference if you're interested in kind of looking at different values exercises, but I just pulled the one that I use. And the great thing about this is you ultimately can change it. You'll even read in the literature that this is something that is used and has been kind of pulled from different places as well. So you can really kind of cater it to the client, and some of the questions that I will ask, like you could change ultimately based on the client that you're working with or what you feel is like important to kind of get to. So just like wanted to add that there, that it's kind of a cool thing to be used, as it can be flexible as well as it can be done more than once as well, because values are ongoing and ever changing. So before we get started, I just kind of wanted to start with the simple question, which I ask is, what are values and what are goals, and kind of what's the difference between the two? And just off the top of your head, like what's the value and what's a goal? Like kind of what's the difference to you?
I like to look at values as something is like what is important to you. And then the goal is like, how do we get to that place of importance? That's kind of how I like to like phrase that and like work through. Cause yeah, they do like just kind of thinking like, okay, like I wanna, like get to my values, I want to get to my goals. People like to kind of like lump those together. And yeah, like sifting through that is really awesome to get started like that.
I often like to say, like, we're very much, in society asked, like, what are your short-term goals? What are your long-term goals? But not often do we really get asked, what are your values, right? And ultimately, values drive our goals, and that values are ongoing and ever changing. However, if you look at a goal that you have, most likely it's tied to a value. So it's great to go back and clarify, especially with people that are even struggling with coming up with goals. It's like center it back to values, and then you can derive those goals out of those values that are important to you right now. I like to kind of point out that values are ongoing and ever changing. So something I'll say to clients is, if I asked you to do this exercise when you were 16 versus now, it's probably a lot different. And knowing that that's something about values, that they're ongoing and ever changing, whereas goals are kind of crossed off and achieved. Like once a goal is had, it's like crossed off, done, where, values are more of kind of that journey and that process. And I also like to point out that values aren't something that we aspire to have, but they're also just kind of the way that we live our lives. It's kind of like, how do I live in the service of this? And I think that's kind of a helpful way of just differentiating between the two simply. Anybody else have any comments on the difference between values and goals before we get started? All right, so this first round, as I call them rounds, I guess for the excitement, but round one, what I like to do is, what I want you to do is actually look at the sheet with all the values. So right now it'll look like this, but on the computer, I had sent this to you guys. What I want you guys to do is actually look at the three different categories. So one will say less important, important, and very important. And what you do is actually go through each of these values and you place them based in the category that you feel to you at this very moment of time personally is important to you. So if I were to look at boldness, I think to myself, okay, that's important to me. It's not very important, but it's important. So I put it in the important category and I move on. I tell people to kind of differentiate between important and very important. Very important is like critical. Like you can't live without this value. Like it's a part of your daily life. It's like almost, if we think of like a legacy, like that's something that you hold true and dear to you. Whereas important, it just has that sense of importance, but it may not be to that critical sense, as well as less important. Oftentimes people will notice like, okay, this may be more of like the superficial materialistic things in life. They're important, but it's just not to that weight that important or very important holds. So basically just go through and be as, freely and open as you can with this. I often encourage clients to separate from what you think you should write down versus what you would actually write down. So kind of doing this without judgment towards yourself. Oftentimes people will look at like, well, honesty, that's not something I've been doing lately, but I think I should, so I put it down. And it's like, is that actually important to you? So really being as free as possible with your answers here, as well as recognizing too that it's ongoing, ever changing, and that This is just kind of for the here and now and for this experience. This is the longest part, by the way. So as long as you kind of set this up, the rest, the second and third round, kind of come easier. Does anyone have questions? One thing I didn't note is that if there's a value that's not listed on here, you're also welcome to write that down. You're not limited to this list. I just often tell clients if I were asked to do this and I didn't have this massive list, that I don't think I would be able to place this many values just right out in front of me. So I think it's just a helpful tool to have, but you're welcome to write a value in there that isn't actually in the packet, but it does a pretty good job of, I think, covering a lot of them.
And you want us to put all of these? I think there's like maybe 30 of them, or
Yes.
okay.
I know that it's kind of like the intensity of at first. And actually with my client that I'm doing this with now, we've done it in like chunks. So it's not like all 3 rounds in just one session. We've taken the time to kind of separate it. Like they're on round 1 right now. So that's this part where they've taken time, done it out of session. Then we'll kind of debrief it today and talk about it.
Gotcha. It does though help like really clarify, since there are so many. It's like it does really pare it down.
It's funny too, when I've done this in larger groups, I've been asked like, have you done this? And I have. And I think it is helpful for us to do the exercises ourselves because they are thought provoking. And I think by doing it, you kind of get a different understanding of it. I often like to remind people to the definitions underneath the values, that ultimately can change based on your perception. So like what adventure means to me may mean something completely different to you, or what's listed on that page. So you respond to ultimately like what your perception of that value is. And the point of this, I often tell, especially in like a psychoeducation or small group setting, I've explored with people, like there's no pressure at the end to share your values or to kind of put this out there. This exercise is simply meant to be for you and that it's introspective. So there's no pressure in ultimately having to share that because, ultimately, just with the fear of judgment, I think it's helpful to kind of phrase this in a very like free, non-judgmental space. Also, if you guys could let me know when you're finished, that way we can kind of gauge where everyone's at. Maybe just a few more minutes. So I'll give 2 more minutes for the sake of time. And if you're still working, you can just kind of join in on the conversation. All right. So if you're still working, no worries. You can always join in on the conversation while we're kind of going through this. So now that round one is finished, after each round, I do a debriefing period. Now, with due to the sake of time, I won't ask as many questions on here that are listed. However, you can really cater it to the person that you're working with. And ultimately, I've done it in many different ways where I've had people actually write down their responses to these questions to kind of think about it more, or just simply answer in the moment without writing it down, which is kind of what we'll do. But my first question is really more so in relation to like an observation, which is just what did you notice as you were going through and sorting through these categories? Any thoughts or feelings that you kind of experienced as you were doing it?
I can definitely tell that a lot of my values have shifted since I've had a kid from like, like leisure, fun, romance to like, security, commitment, problem solving kind of stuff. And again, it's not like I like how all this is phrased because it's not like I don't value those things still, but it's just less important than these other things.
Right. It's kind of like honoring the season of life that you're in. And it's actually interesting. I was even going through and reading some of the questions, and even my instructions just make it a reminder, like to make sure that, that you focus on whether there were no right or wrong answers and that no one would know. Like this is really meant to be in a free space. And that's why actually I love the fact that this can be done individually as well. But thanks for sharing that. Anyone else just have any like initial thoughts or feelings that came through as they were doing this?
Yeah, I think that like that's stressing that like it is like a free space and like there's no judgment, because like I find myself sometimes like looking at it and be like, oh, should I value that more? And I don't. But then I'm like, why am I like, judging myself for like what's important to me? So I then like put it in like the lesser category versus the more.
Yeah, I think that's just our innate response, all of us, to do that, or reaction, I should say, of what we want to lean into what we think should be important to us rather than what is important to us.
Right. It's like, should all of these be important to me? Right.
And I always say, and I've had clients say that before, like, shouldn't all of these be important to me? And I'm like, it's based on like your perspective. It's nothing about like my judgment or what I think ultimately impacts this exercise. It's up to you. And I think it's a reminder of like these things ultimately hold importance. It's more so like, what are you trying to live in the service of right now? Like what values do you hold right now and want to honor? So that I think is often a response, as well as clients will often say, I didn't realize how much was important to me. I commonly get this with substance use patients of like, I didn't even realize I had this much that was important to me. I thought I had nothing in my life that had significance or importance. So I think even with depressed clients, they could very much relate to that as well, of like, oh, wow, this is powerful. Like I have a lot that's important to me that maybe I haven't necessarily, been acting on, or that hasn't been in the forefront of my mind, but in some ways it's still been within me. And I think that in itself instills hope. So oftentimes then I'll ask, did you feel pulled to down to what you thought were right answers, that rather than answers that were freely chosen? Who determined what those right answers were? How did you go about sorting? So kind of questions of this nature that we sort of touched on within the first question. And I think, often it's just kind of hitting home on that initial response of, did you experience the shoulds or what you think is right versus wrong, and kind of exploring that. Any other initial thoughts or feelings before we go on to the next round?
I was just going to say, I noticed a lot of similar themes, or just like a theme in general of like what was very important to me, and even to like less important. They were kind of not similar, but they fit into a very like structured category. Like, for example, a lot of like my very important had to do with like being like kind to like other people, or like how I would help other people. But then also too, there was a lot of like the more, I don't even know what the right word for it is, but just like humor and fun and leisure. So a lot of these like lighter values, I guess. But I just noticed that like in each of the different categories, they all kind of had like a theme that was there. So that was kind of cool to see.
It's interesting that you said that, because I often will like refer to them as like an umbrella. Like oftentimes people notice themes and it's like, oh, it's just kind of like this umbrella of these things all connect and kind of go together.
Yeah.
So that's actually a common response as well.
Yeah.
I feel like for mine, the very important ones, like there were some that I noticed like, okay, maybe years ago they've shifted,
Mhm.
but I feel like, I don't know, I feel like a lot of my values, like, oh, these have been values of mine for so long. And I would actually describe it like as a personality trait. Like,
Mhm.
for instance, like being very curious, like openness, boldness, wanting community, wanting connection. Like, I feel like that's, if you were to ask, like, oh, how was Jenna when she was 10 or 15? Like, people would probably say, like, oh, she probably had those values. Like, it just seems to be kind of the same, which was interesting.
That is interesting. And I think that often I would, if you were a client, I would encourage you to look at, wow, what a strength to know that how sure of your, yourself that you are, and that there's just such integral parts of you that have adapted and formed through these different seasons of your life. And that's often how I've kind of framed that with clients that have like been like, oh, wow, like there's 10 on there that I go without saying that are just a huge part of me and a huge part of my life and are at my very core.
Yeah. Interesting.
All
Thanks.
right,
Kate.
so moving on to the next round. Sorry if we didn't get to have Katie. I don't know if you wanted to say something, but you can share it in the next round. I feel bad that we're running out of time because I know we're ending at 45 today, right? This exercise, honestly, you could spend, I think, a few hours with someone on. I would always struggle. I was given like an hour and 15 when I'd done it in a psychoeducation setting, and it was always like very hard to get through, and everyone wants to share. So it's tough, and that's why it's great kind of doing it in those chunks. And honestly, I probably encourage it that way, so that way it doesn't feel rushed in the way that it may feel today. All right, so round 2, I want everyone to select 8 values that they would consider to choose most important. So this would be ultimately in your very important category. However, I do encourage people to look at all 3 before you select those 8, as you're welcome to change your mind. So say you do see something in the important category and you're like, oh, wait, I want to have that in my top 8. You're more than welcome to include that. So it's not limited to the very important category. However, sometimes it just works out that way. So what you would do is then just like circle the 8 that you would select. And a way of, again, kind of framing this is that this is something that if you look at your life, like if I lived in the service of these values, would I consider it to be like a life well lived? So basically, like these are at your very core. You can't imagine your life without these 8 values at this point in time. All right, so if you're still selecting your 8, no worries. Actually, in the instructions, it asks you to select 10. I've always stuck with 8. I feel like 10 is too many when we're trying to clarify, and you may kind of see where I'm going with this, but ultimately the next round gets a little harder. So I like to make it 8 versus 10 just to kind of narrow it down a little more. And again, I debrief this aspect of the exercise as well. And I ask similar questions of like, just any thoughts or feelings that you experienced. Oftentimes I'll ask people how they felt when they discarded like the values they didn't include. And just to kind of give a typical response from someone like in substance abuse, that often would be like this realization of, I've actually been discarding a lot of these values all along, and it can kind of elicit feelings of guilt or shame. Oftentimes of like, I think this should be important to me, but it's just not right now. So sometimes those feelings will kind of erupt. But I'm curious, anyone else kind of notice any feelings of like how it felt to discard the ones you didn't include, or just any initial thoughts from round 2? Sometimes people talk about, oh, this was much easier for me. It's much easier for me to decipher between what's most important versus what's less important. Or they'll say this was harder. So anyone kind of have that experience?
Yeah, I, reminded myself like I'm not like throwing away these values. I'm, like everything is still, like within me, but like these are the ones that I really want to like tap into a little bit more. So, yeah, I think just kind of like that validation, like it's okay. You're not like eliminating this. It's not saying like, responsibility is no longer a value of mine, but like maybe
Right.
like curiosity is a little bit more so like within my core.
That's often something I will do as well, is like reassure, like, that ultimately when you walk out of this room today, like these values are all important to you. Like they're not going anywhere. We're just kind of narrowing down what's most important to you right now. Oftentimes too, as I mentioned, like that kind of sense of guilt surrounding like discarding these. I've even had someone say to me, like, when I look at these 8s, with my addiction, I was 1/8 of myself. Like this is how far away I was from living within my value system and living within myself. So again, it's just like by narrowing it down, I think it gives a kind of what Jenna was saying, like you can really almost see your personality in these values, and just like who you are as a person tends to be embodied by these values that you kind of see and look down at right now. So moving on to round 3, I will read a passage to you guys. And I like to read this passage just because I think it really puts and summarize kind of like the whole exercise in general, and just the point, and kind of helps you, I think, narrow it down. So now I would like you guys to choose your top 3 values that you would consider to choose most important. So you select these 3 out of your top 8. If you could only choose 3 to focus on being in your life, assuming there were no right or wrong answers and that you were completely free to choose, which 3 would you choose? Remember, these values aren't just the things you'd like to accomplish, have, or what you'd enjoy the most. Rather, values are those ways of being in the world that you would most want to dedicate your life to. You guys are all looking at me like, this is supposed to be fun. So some of the questions to debrief this I may ask are, how did you choose your top 3? So kind of how did you get to this point? Do these 3 have anything in common? So kind of going back to what Rachel was saying, like, do you notice a theme or a connection between these 3? Sometimes people will be like, yeah, absolutely. I see this theme. Oftentimes, like if I've done this with substance use patients, it's like these 3 things, if I live in the service of these and I'm connected to these 3 values, then I can maintain my sobriety or my recovery with these 3 things. Like these 3 things are just vital to that. Oftentimes, then sometimes people will be like, no, they're completely separate. They aren't related. Although a lot of the time, I think mainly people see some sort of connection or theme. And then the last question I typically will ask is like, as you look at these 3 values, would you say living in the service of these values would be a life well lived? And oftentimes people are like, yes, this is like, be living my best life if I'm aligned with these and really truly living in the service of them. Does anyone want to answer any of those, or how you chose your top 3, if you noticed a theme?
I think because I noticed a lot of themes, I tried to pick like 3 that encompass like more than just like one of them. Like I'll give an example of like I picked openness, but that also goes into like genuineness, like connection, right? That are also important to me. But like I see that also as like openness too, because it's like if I'm open and like willing to, so it's like I group them together in my mind a little bit more.
Yeah, I see people do that all the time. It's kind of a way to like cheat and get more values in there. Is like, okay, if I look at this one, how
Yes.
can I get,
Yes.
growth and creativity? Maybe I see those 2 together, so I choose growth, which is, a great way of going about it, and it definitely feels less limiting, because I will always have like someone that'll be like, I just want to add 4. Please, can I have a 4th? And I'm like, as soon as this is over, you absolutely can.
I think the 3 that I picked would offer comfortability to like me and my family. And there's nothing just more satisfying and like wonderful to me to think than just being comfortable in life. And for my family too. So they all go together in that way.
Cool. Security, contentment, all of those things. I often ask people to like, what did you learn about yourself? Like, did anything surprise you, or anything kind of come through, or like, how can you apply this to your recovery, or how can you apply this to your sobriety or to your life? And oftentimes it can kind of curate a conversation surrounding goals too. So again, if you're having someone that's really stuck and having a hard time even setting goals, this is a great way to kind of deepen that why and go back to purpose, as I was saying, rather than looking at motivation or desire and discipline. Anyone have any final thoughts?
Do you kind of have your client or yourself like keep this in mind for them to keep kind of referencing and going back to throughout your work together?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Because yeah, I feel like this conversation is so important, and even just doing this, like, thank you. Like, this was really kind of eye-opening, and to kind of see like the root of things, and what really, really matters, and like living a life that matters. And I could also see how it could be difficult to like I have to like put this on a Post-it and like put it next to me to remember and reflect on every day. And so even like with our clients, you can see. Thank you, Jenna.
That's why I do the writing it down versus the cutting the pieces out. I don't know. I just feel like, maybe you could cut the 3 out and like have that, but there's something about, I think, like actually writing it down and seeing it all come together that I think is really cathartic about it. But yeah, I definitely, I've been doing this exercise now for a few years, and like I said, in an individual format, but also I've done a lot of it with like the psychoeducation format. And I remember having people, like, even when they were in treatment, like literally having this and hanging it on their wall and whatnot, and where they were staying. So I think it is great to reference back to it, whether you need it as a visual, or like with your client kind of going back to touching on it and ultimately talking about it. But I can say like this exercise and just values in general when it comes to acceptance commitment therapy has totally changed the way that I work with my clients, and that values come up in conversation. And I'm sure for many of you as well, all the time. And that's why I love this exercise, because it's like there's so many bits and pieces you can really take away from it. And I think especially with our clients that feel really stuck, have low self-esteem, feel stagnant in their lives, this is a great tool to utilize, as well as just any of these questions that we talked about today, kind of having questions surrounding that. And I truly think like living a value-driven life leads to greater purpose.
Totally. Wow. Well, thank you so much. I know we're at time since we're condensing our meetings now, but this was excellent and super, super helpful. And I like how you did it in rounds, because now I can see with a client, like, okay, maybe we'll just do round 1 and then we'll continue with the other rounds, other sessions.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's less overwhelming. And if anyone has any questions about values or just like these exercises in general, feel free to reach out to me.